sometimes we notice that something within ourselves begins to feel heavy without really knowing why. Days become longer, thoughts slower, and even simple gestures require an effort that once went unnoticed. This is not laziness or a lack of willpower. It's a fatigue that comes from a deeper place, where emotions, expectations, and unspoken disappointments intersect.
We keep moving forward as if nothing is wrong, telling ourselves that everything will eventually work out. But the body and mind send signals that don't lie. A tension in the neck that returns every morning, difficulty breathing fully, or that feeling of living slightly out of sync with oneself. This kind of weariness often arises when we walk too long without an inner pause, when we manage the unexpected, obligations, complicated relationships, and worries without ever taking the time to understand what all this provokes within us. At first, we cope, we adapt, we tell ourselves we can hold on a little longer. But emotional fatigue is not simple exhaustion. It seeps into thoughts, colors emotions, and eventually changes the way we perceive life. Even pleasant moments feel distant, as if something blocks access to gentleness. Gradually, we begin to feel a form of detachment, not because we no longer care about others or important things, but because the mind seeks to conserve whatever energy remains. It's a discreet, almost silent survival strategy. We become more sensitive to the slightest conflict, more vulnerable to criticism, more fragile in the face of the unexpected. Sometimes we find ourselves avoiding conversations, postponing decisions, locking into routines that mainly serve to avoid facing what overwhelms us. This fatigue settles precisely in those spaces where we prefer to ignore rather than feel. The most deceptive part of it is that we often give the impression of being fine. We smile, we manage, we respond as we should. Outwardly, nothing indicates that we are fighting against a constant internal current. But the moment we are alone, we realize that even the slightest frustration is enough to exhaust us. Emotions barely hold, the mind wavers, and the body struggles to follow. That's when we understand that this feeling, which never disappears, doesn't come from a lack of sleep, but from an overload of things undigested, unsaid, unacknowledged.
What we often forget is that emotional exhaustion never comes from a single event. It builds from a stack of small pensions, silent compromises, responsibilities carried too long without putting them in their rightful place. We tell ourselves we must hold on, that it's normal to be tired, that it happens to everyone. But by minimizing what we feel, we eventually cross the limit without noticing.
We notice that we no longer savor anything, that joy seems too distant, that we live in a permanent economy of energy. This fatigue will not disappear until we give it a place, until we listen to it sincerely. One of the particularities of this persistent fatigue is that it gradually clouds the way we perceive ourselves. We begin to doubt our abilities, to wonder if we have become more fragile than before, less competent, less stable. Yet, this is not weakness. It is a signal, a sign that the mind has been asked to operate beyond its resources, often without our noticing. When the inside is saturated, the outside becomes harder to manage. Even the simplest decisions take longer, as if every thought must pass through a cluttered space before reaching its destination. Over time, this saturation can create a sense of being out of step with others. We see people moving through life with ease, seemingly effortlessly. We see them laughing, discussing, engaging in activities, and we wonder why it seems so simple for them and so complicated for us. This gap often fuels a feeling of isolation, not imposed isolation, but an inner sense of no longer being able to connect in the same way as before. We participate in conversations, smile when necessary, but feel that something no longer flows normally inside, and this can also lead to an involuntary emotional withdrawal. Not because we no longer wish to connect, but because each interaction seems to demand energy that is already scarce. This retreat is not a lack of affection. It's an attempt to protect oneself from additional overload. Emotional exhaustion often pushes us to reduce anything that seems to add internal noise, even if that noise comes from people we deeply care about. Paradoxically, it is often during these periods that we become more sensitive. A misplaced word can weigh more than it should. A casual remark can trigger disproportionate agitation. The already fragile mind reacts more intensely to external disturbances. This is not gratuitous sensitivity. It reflects an emotional system at the end of its rope, trying to cope with the little energy available. We then find ourselves craving silence, gentleness, slowness, as if the outside world is too strong, too fast, too demanding. And yet, amid this discrete whirlwind, we feel a deep need to understand what is really happening, not to find an immediate solution, but to put words to what seemed diffuse. Recognizing this type of fatigue requires a form of honesty with oneself, sometimes harder than we imagine. It means admitting that we have gone too far, that we asked our minds to endure more than they could. But this act, as simple as it seems, often marks the beginning of relief because we cannot ease what we refuse to see. When we finally begin to observe this fatigue with more lucidity, we realize that it does not come only from external events, but also from the way we treated ourselves during all this time. We asked our mind to remain strong without interruption, to stay clear amidst chaos, to be patient when everything around lacked gentleness. This often silent internal pressure eventually creates a gap between what we experience and the image we try to maintain. This gap becomes an additional source of exhaustion because it demands playing a role when what we truly need is a moment of truth. We then notice that we have accumulated too many invisible responsibilities, the ones no one sees, but we carry out of habit or necessity. Being the one who reassures, organizes, holds things together, absorbs tension to avoid conflict. This repeated posture wears down the mind more than any concrete task because it requires constant vigilance. Even when the body rests, the mind keeps turning, anticipating, worrying. That's when emotional fatigue strengthens in the impossibility of complete relaxation. There are also the expectations we hold for ourselves. We want to be strong, stable, consistent, always available. We want to continue moving forward as if slowing down meant failing. But the mind is not a machine, and when we refuse to heed its signals, it eventually expresses itself differently. It makes us slower, more scattered, sometimes more anxious. It changes our relationship with time, with relationships, and even with self-perception. This fatigue is not a whim. It is a natural reaction of a saturated system that can no longer filter what happens to it. At this stage, many experience a loss of inner clarity. Not total confusion, but a light fog that envelopes everything. We know what should be done, but we cannot act. We perceive what burdens us, but no longer have the momentum to free ourselves. This stagnation creates a feeling of powerlessness that further weighs on the mind. Yet, this stagnation is not a permanent blockage. It is often a pause imposed by the body and mind to prevent us from sinking further. And then comes the particular moment when we understand that continuing the same way will lead nowhere. It's not a spectacular revelation, it's a calm observation. We feel that something must change, even if we don't yet know what. We sense that this fatigue will not dissipate until we have relearned to care for ourselves differently. This moment is essential because it marks the first crack in the wall of resistance we had built. It is then that the mind slowly begins to seek a path toward relief. It is often from this awareness that we start exploring what internally truly requires attention. We realize that emotional exhaustion will not disappear by forcing ourselves to do more or to trying desperately to regain the energy we once had. On the contrary, the more we struggle, the deeper we sink. What suits is not effort, but acknowledgement. Facing what hurts, what weighs, what we accumulated in silence. This act, however simple, requires courage because it forces us to recognize limits we long refused to have. As we observe this fatigue, we also understand that it sometimes comes from the gap between the life we live and what we truly need. Living in permanent tension, trying to respond to everything, adapting to everyone, carrying multiple roles without pause. All this creates a distance between ourselves and our own rhythm. The mind protests, not to punish us, but to restore balance. It reminds us that certain emotions were neglected, certain wounds never treated, certain needs ignored for too long. Emotional exhaustion then becomes a kind of language. The only way the body signals that a change is necessary. Often, this fatigue comes with a loss of inner drive. We feel less curiosity, less capacity to project ourselves, less desire to open up to new experiences. It's not indifference. it is a form of protection. The mind seeks to preserve itself by reducing exposure to anything that could create additional overload. This can create the feeling of no longer recognizing the person we once were, the one more spontaneous, more lighthearted. But this phase is not erasure. It's a necessary slowdown, a way to reconnect with the inner self without being pulled in every direction. During this period, it becomes essential to welcome what we feel without judgment. Emotional fatigue intensifies when we try to hide or trivialize it. Recognizing that we are at the end of our rope, that we can no longer handle what we used to, that we feel saturated, is not an admission of failure. It's an act of lucidity. It requires gentleness, a gentleness we may not have learned to give ourselves. Being attentive to oneself does not mean seeking immediate solutions, but creating a space where we can finally breathe without pressure. From there, something begins to transform. Fatigue does not disappear overnight, but it ceases to be an immovable block. It becomes more legible, more understandable. We realize that some burdens are not ours, that some tensions come from responsibilities assumed by habit rather than choice. We understand that we have the right to set boundaries, to say no, to slow down, not to always be available. It is often in this discreet readjustment that a first glimmer of relief emerges, a deeper breath, a clearer thought, a moment where we feel a little more aligned with ourselves. These are small signs, but they indicate that the mind regains space to rebuild. Gradually, by reorganizing this inner space, we see more clearly what truly nourishes and what exhausts. We begin to notice situations that drain energy almost instantly, situations where we feel obliged to meet expectations that are not ours, where we move away from ourselves to preserve a facade. This awareness does not happen all at once. It builds over discrete moments. Often, when we notice ourselves breathing more freely after setting a boundary or taking a long-delayed break, these moments reveal how emotional exhaustion was not only fatigue, but also a sign of misalignment with our own needs. At this stage, it becomes necessary to redefine how we are present in the world, not by cutting ties or isolating ourselves, but by learning to respect ourselves more in every interaction. This implies paying attention to how we expose ourselves, observing what triggers internal tensions, recognizing situations where we forget ourselves. It is not a process of withdrawal, but of refocusing. The idea is not to protect ourselves from the world, but to stop imposing a rhythm that contradicts what we feel. This learning takes time because it requires dismantling deeply rooted habits. There is also another aspect we understand better at this point: the importance of inner silence. Not the silence that suffocates, but the one that soothes, that allows us to hear again what we really feel. When going through a period of emotional exhaustion, the mind is saturated with noise, alerts, looping thoughts. Finding even a small sense of calm becomes a restorative act. Sometimes this comes through simple gestures like walking without purpose, breathing mindfully, spending a few minutes without external demands. These moments do not solve everything, but they give the mind a space to regulate itself. As this calm gradually returns, we rediscover a truth we had forgotten. We were never meant to carry everything alone. Emotional exhaustion often develops when we isolate ourselves in our own expectations, when we think we must always be sufficient, without support or pause. Recognizing that we have the right to be vulnerable, that we can ask for help, that we are not obliged to be infallible, is essential. It does not make fatigue any less real, but it opens a door to a gentler relationship with ourselves. Something subtle happens from there. The mind that until now functioned in survival mode begins to relax. Emotions become less overwhelming. The body feels a little less tense, thoughts less scattered. This is not a spectacular transformation, but a gradual reconstruction, gesture by gesture, choice by choice. And in this slow evolution, we feel that we regain a form of inner solidity. Not the rigid solidity we thought we had to show, but a flexible solidity capable of welcoming, feeling, and preserving without closing off. As this inner solidity rebuilds, we begin to notice subtle changes in how we face daily life. Situations that once seemed insurmountable become more manageable, not because they have changed, but because we approach them no longer from a state of permanent tension. The mind regains space to reflect, feel, and decide with more clarity. Some things that exhausted us no longer provoke the same reaction, while others still require adjustment. This more attentive and less impulsive observation often signals that we are reconnecting with our own limits. This reconnection also brings a finer understanding of our real needs. We realized that we had learned to function in a mode that no longer matched our inner rhythm. Accepting that we cannot absorb everything, solve everything, understand everything immediately becomes a form of emotional maturity. This acceptance is not resignation. It is a way to honor our resources. It allows us to choose more consciously what we want to keep in our life and what we must leave behind. This may involve habits, responsibilities, sometimes even relational dynamics that have proven too costly for the mind. In this readjustment, we often discover that emotional fatigue was not only the result of overload, but also of a lack of inner breathing. We lived in a cycle of obligation, repetitive thoughts, automatic gestures, without giving ourselves real pauses to feel what was right for us. Reintroducing even brief, personal spaces changes how we navigate difficulties. It brings a flexibility that was inaccessible when overwhelmed. We regain the right to slow down, observe, choose without guilt or justification. Gradually, this new way of inhabiting our lives creates a sense of relief we had almost forgotten. It's not perfect calm, but a gentle stability that allows us to face daily fluctuations without collapsing. We begin to feel less vulnerable to the unexpected, less fragile in the face of external expectations. This stability does not come from brute force, but from alignment between what we feel and what we allow ourselves to experience. This inner connection, once restored, becomes a source of clarity guiding decisions, relationships, commitments. And sometimes, in the heart of this reconstruction, we realize something even more important. Emotional fatigue never fully disappears at once. It dissipates layer by layer, slowly, in rhythm with what we understand and transform. Some days are lighter, others recall the old weight, but this alternation is part of the process. It's not a regression. It's an invitation to continue taking care of oneself consistently. The mind does not demand perfection, it demands attention. This attention, when it becomes a sincere habit, gradually replaces exhaustion with a lasting peace. At this stage of the inner journey, we realize that the essential thing is not to erase all traces of fatigue, but to learn to live in accordance with what we truly feel. Emotional exhaustion does not come to diminish us. It comes to signal that our view of ourselves must evolve. It shows where we forgot ourselves, the promises we did not keep to ourselves, the needs we left behind out of reflex or loyalty to external expectations. Understanding this transforms the way we approach our own life. It is no longer a struggle against ourselves, but a path back to something fairer, calmer, and more sincere. Over time, we learn that true strength does not lie in holding on at all costs, but in the ability to listen before reaching a breaking point. This listening is not a withdrawal from the world. It is an act of presence toward oneself. It allows us to recognize early signals before they become overwhelming, to rebalance priorities, to preserve what is essential. We also understand that emotional balance is never fixed. It is built, challenged, reconstructed at the pace of changes, challenges, encounters. The important thing is no longer letting ourselves slip unconsciously into a saturated state that slowly consumes the zest for life. In this process, we also become more attentive to the quality of relationships around us. Connections that demand disproportionate energy become more visible, as do those that provide calming presence. This relational clarity is not radical pruning, but awareness. It allows us to recognize spaces where we can be ourselves effortlessly, where we breathe more freely, where we are nourished rather than drained. Choosing these spaces mindfully builds an emotional stability that becomes a precious resource for navigating difficult periods. And one day, almost without noticing, we see that the fatigue that seemed endless has lost its grip. It has not disappeared from the landscape, but it no longer occupies all the inner space. In its place is a finer understanding of our limits, a gentleness in self-talk, a lucidity in engagement. We no longer